There are a lot of art historians in this room. So how many have been to see the Ghent altarpiece? Okay, I thought there'd be more hands than, okay. So some of this may be familiar. Reading glasses. In 2012, the exhibition Sint-Jan opened in Sint-Bavs, also known in French as Saint Bavos, Cathedral in Ghent. The exhibition was a collaboration between curators Jan Hoot and Hans Martens with considerable input from participating artist Chris Martin. In this paper, I examine the centrality of the adoration of the mystic lamb by brothers Hubert and Jan van Eyck for the Sint-Jan exhibition, for Jan Hoot, the city of Ghent, and for Flanders, the northern Dutch-speaking region of Belgium. I note the conflation of curator with saint in several pieces in the exhibit with Jan Hoot, or the idea of Hoot, serving as the contemporary pilgrimage focus. I also analyze Hoot's curatorial decisions in the placement of each artwork, which I believe both underscored and disrupted the ritual and pilgrimage spaces of the church. Jan Hoot chose St. Baf's Cathedral as the venue for the exhibition because it houses the adoration of the mystic lamb, in Dutch, Het Lam God, by Hubert and Jan van Eyck. The name refers to the central panel of the interior of the famous polyptych. The mystic lamb, or the Lamb of God, is the direct translation from French. It's the preferred name for what those outside of Belgium refer to as the Ghent altarpiece. The title of the exhibition, Sint-Jan, acknowledges the original church, Sint-Jan of 942, dedicated to St. John the Baptist, traces of which are still discernible in the crypt in the current Gothic St. Baf's. The church was in an almost constant state of construction with expansive additions reflecting the grand identity of the city. In 1274, a Gothic church replaced the Romanesque. Around 1420, Jodicus Vade and Lisbeth Borluut commissioned Hubert van Eyck of nearby Bruges to create an altarpiece for their personal chapel in St. Jan. Vade was the warden of the church and the assistant burgomaster of Ghent. They were a wealthy couple, wealthy enough to finance the 25-panel altarpiece. In 1422, Hubert van Eyck designed the layout of the altarpiece but died soon after, and Jan completed the panels in 1435. Hoot's title of Sint-Jan exhibit is also a nod to Jan van Eyck, whose painterly vision was extraordinarily innovative. Jan created a theatrical contrast between the exterior and interior, the latter of which was only visible during feast days. The exterior features a pious Vade and Borluut in subdued but luxurious clothing, underscoring the wealth of the cloth industry in Flanders. Their devotion is directed to Saints John the Baptist, the namesake of the church, and John the Evangelist. The subdued drama of the Annunciation panels above are presented in mutual shades of ethereal white. Glimpses of the Ghent cityscape are spread across the four panels, which serves to locate the church of St. Jan, patrons Vade and Borluut, and the wondrous narrative of the mystic lamb, all within the environs of Ghent. Upon opening the exterior panels of the mystic lamb, sumptuous color greets the viewer. Jan introduced a new emphasis on naturalism realism into an overtly religious and symbolic Byzantine painting tradition. He also advanced a new way of seeing, casting the audience as participants in the transcendent scene unfolding before them to elicit a calculated emotional and spiritual response. Jan was the first to forge a sense of continuity between the pictorial spiritual and the real world. For the first time on such a scale was a picture of the completely natural world saturated by the light of God. And I added this note after hearing some papers already. As we discussed with the idea of the pilgrimage as a mystical event taken on through the eyes as they visit this pilgrimage space that's well outside, of course, the traditional site and where this event would have unfolded. At its unveiling in 1435, the mystical lamb was regarded as the supreme symbol of Flemish art. By the end of the 15th century, St. Baf's and Hubert and Jan van Eyck's mystic lamb was a pilgrimage destination. In 1495, Hieronymus Munzer, a humanist and geographer and a contributor to the Nuremberg Chronicle, described the mystic lamb as encompassing the whole art of painting. The German artist Albrecht Dürer visited the altarpiece in 1521. He noted in his travel report of the extraordinarily beautiful and well-executed painting. In particular, Eve, Mary, and God the Father are extremely good. Moreover, Ghent is pretty and is a wonderful city. Scores of pilgrims and secular visitors signed their names to the visitation books throughout the 16th century. And what I'm showing you here is a painting created obviously many years later, of Albrecht Dürer's historic visitation. But what you're seeing here is the altarpiece in its original place in the Vade Chapel, because now when we visit it, it's off to the side behind glass after an extensive renovation. So it's no longer here, but this would have served a much better pilgrimage site, as many of you know, as you move through the church and look to the side chapels for different types of relics. In the aftermath of the 1539 rebellion against the Emperor Charles V in Ghent, the Abbey of St. Bafs was dissolved. The abbot and monks became canons in a chapter that was attached to what became the Church of St. Bafs, named in honor of the former abbey, and for St. Baf, the patron saint of Ghent. In 1559, the Diocese of Ghent was founded, and St. Baf's church became a cathedral. Interest in the mystic lamb waned. During the Napoleonic Wars, after a brief return to Ghent from the Musée de Napoleon, the church wardens sold the wings to a Brussels art dealer in 1816. Through a series of consecutive sales, these panels were added to the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in 1904. After the Treaty of Versailles, they returned to Belgium. By the early 19th century, at the formation of the country of Belgium, it was almost forgotten as a key moment in the historiography of art and as an icon for Flemish identity. Belgium was formed in 1830, creating a single nation from two distinct language and cultural groups, the Flemish speakers in the north and the French-speaking Walloons in the south. From its very inception, the country has been in a constant state of unrest between these two linguistic and cultural regions. In 1831, historians asked, "What is it to be Belgian?" This query had a profound effect on the physical and cultural dismantling of the altarpiece. Flemish heritage was subsumed in the creation of a Belgian identity, as defined by historian Henri Pirenne as the civilisation commune of the Belgian people, and not through language or culture, although, as an aside, the dominant language and culture was French. The mystic lamb was physically severed from its Flemish home when, in 1861, the French-speaking Belgian government persuaded St. Bafs to sell the Adam and Eve panels to the Brussels Museum. Additionally, in the 19th century, an attempt to link the mystic lamb to a Germanic historiography turned it into a symbol of the fragmentation of Belgian identity that mirrored the physical division and distribution of the panels. Art historians formulated a Germanic theory for Van Eyck's heart from the late 19th century into the 20th. After the Second World War, the art historian Erwin Panofsky linked Jan van Eyck and other Flemish painters to a Netherlandish tradition that encompassed a national Dutch heritage and underscored the link with Germanic origins. At the turn of the century, historian Henri Bouchot emphasized Flemish dependency on French painting, going so far as to question the very existence of Jan van Eyck. Other scholars followed suit in agreement with Bouchot, disputing the Germanic link in favor of a French connection. In the 1990s, Penny Howell-Jolly suggested that Jan van Eyck travel to Italy, where he was inspired by the Annunciation in Santa Annunziata in Florence. Jolly's scholarship presents the altarpiece as an exchange of ideas across the divide of North and South, connecting with the Belgian histories of Pirenne, who celebrated Belgium as a fusion of Latin and Germanic traditions. After the recovery of the altarpiece from Hitler's salt mines in Austria, the panels were reassembled in St. Bafs. The triumphant return of the altarpiece, which was welcomed back into Ghent with a grand parade, was then celebrated as a sign of Flemishness. The title Sint-Jan, of course, is also a direct reference to curator Jan Hout. Hout was born in Leuven in the Flemish region of Brabant. In his adopted city of Ghent, specifically, and Flanders more generally, Hout served as an image interpreter, much as Jan van Eyck did in the 15th century. He was known as the Pope of Art in Flanders. Hout was instrumental in making contemporary art physically, intellectually, and spiritually accessible to Gentenaars, and for founding SMAC, the Municipal Museum of Contemporary Art in Ghent. Throughout his career, he championed up-and-coming Flemish artists as well as the city of Ghent. The altarpiece of the Mystic Lamb was core to Hout's identity. Every artist and curatorial assistant to Hout I interviewed noted that many of their meetings took place in St. Bafs in front of or near the Mystic Lamb. Artist Chris Martin told me that Hoot visited it every day. Luc Vredach, who just completed Thank God for the Gift, a film about Hoot, noted that, quote, "The altarpiece is a mosaic of stories and characters. It is full of mysticism and symbolism and sins and virtues, a lot of the elements and contrasts you also find in the life of Jan Hoot." Sint-Bafs. For the exhibition, Jan Hoot focused on the mystic lamb, as it was an already familiar site for tourists and pilgrims alike. But he also redirected attention from the mystic lamb, the soaring heights of the vaults, and the main altar through a curated exhibition that formally forced visitors to search the nave and side aisles for small relics, as he called them, objects that were, in the Middle Ages, integral to the collection of the diocese and the ritual pathway of practitioners. The exterior and plan of Sint-Bafs is a typical Gothic Latin cross. The main entrance is at the west of the building. It has a long central nave, transepts that form the arms of the cross, and a large apse at the east end with radiating chapels. Key structural elements, like the rib vaults and flying buttresses, allow for tall, light-filled spaces and a sense of verticality. When entering the cathedral, the form obliged pilgrims to look down the nave to the altar, the spiritual center, and directed to the pointed arches and light of the clerestory up. Historically, the cathedral has shaped the reception of art through its static form, its function as an authoritative space to view works of art, and its centrality in public life. Since the 19th century, the museum has displaced that role. In Civilizing Rituals, Carol Duncan examined the making and presenting of art to the public, linking the performance of ritual in a cathedral to similar practice in art museums, as both to serve, to communicate, and affirm ideas and social identity. Her thesis was reinforced in Sint-Jan as visitors moved through the cathedral, stopping at predetermined sites to contemplate an installation composed of contemporary art. But unlike the visual and material culture traditionally found in the Gothic cathedral, which clearly communicated a singular narrative to the viewer, several of the contemporary pieces in Sint-Jan offered multiple interpretations, encouraging visitors to question their relationship to the contemplative objects on display and disrupted the expected reaction to the form of the cathedral itself. For example, in Chris Martin's Mandi, comprised of an 8mm steel and bronze sword, was hoisted to the same height as the belfry. This reference to the sword of Damocles produced a feeling, understandably, of unease as visitors looked upward toward the pointed tip as they stepped inside this spiritual haven. The vertically hung sword thus disrupted the expected reaction to the upward gaze. In Mandi, Martin also captured the tension inherent in Catholicism between the punitive, Romanesque, and forgiving Gothic ideology mapped in the architectural history of Sint-Bafs transitions between the two periods. For Untitled, David Muir hit a phone in the cathedral, forcing visitors to look throughout the entirety of the space, moving beyond the natural orientations to the altar and vaults when he called its number. Because of the well-publicized illness, Hoot had died 2 years after this exhibit was put on. Both artists and audiences were aware that Sint-Jan could be his last exhibit. In forging a partnership with Sint-Bafs, Hoot acknowledged himself as Pope of Art in a history of both collaborative practice and as the singular and revered position of curator. In some ways, he became the icon rather than the adoration of the mystic lamb. Fashion artist Yvette Lauwart pointedly created an altar to Hoot, placed in the original crypt of Sint-Jan, of the Sint-Jan Church. It was made from the dust and hair she had collected from Hoot during the opening of Smaak some 26 years earlier. Inadvertently, Lauwart's piece became the relic around which the rest of the exhibition revolved. A few other pieces also directly referenced Hoot. Anne Wenzel presented Requiem of Heroism, Jan, a glazed ceramic head of Hoot, transforming the biblical story of St. John the Baptist into a new narrative, offering the curator's head as a relic to the public. Marlene Dumas' Girl with Head depicts Salome holding her trophy head of St. John the Baptist, but instead of the Baptist, it is a portrait of Hoot from a series that Dumas made for him in 1992. Additional artworks ask the visitors to contemplate the connection between the spirituality of the cathedral and the contemporary art inserted into that spiritual space. Ben Benoit's ladder refers to the descent from the cross. In the descent, the ladder is a seemingly banal object, with the primary focus on the grieving figures and the dead Christ himself. But the ladder symbolizes a connection, here between the celestial and the terrestrial, and for Hoot, the connection between the art and the public access to that art. The canvas renders the ladder useless, while at the same time elevates it to an art object and out of banality. It remains at a remove from the ornateness of the Sint-Baf interior, with an emphasis and reminder of the functionality within ritual space. Bruce Naumann's Life, Death was installed above a commemorative plaque to the Ghent dead of the Great War. Naumann juxtaposes bright colors with white LED letters spelling out life, death, love, hate, pleasure, and pain. The combination of the two produces a jarring effect. It is difficult to discern the text. Naumann underscores the inability of language to deliver a fixed or stable meaning, which echoes the remit of the Sint-Jan exhibition. The placement of life-death also validates the memory of the dead soldiers who, through a post-war Flemish narrative, became martyrs for Flanders through the frame of a Flemish and not Belgian national rhetoric. It also asks visitors to engage with a section of the cathedral frequently simply bypassed as they made their way down the nave, and also asks them to engage with this very political memorial device. The 10th century Sint-Baf, upon his conversion, recognized the emptiness in owning material objects and donated his fortune to the poor. It is not without considerable acknowledged irony that the Sint-Jan exhibit was filled with contemporary art in high demand by collectors and held within a space rich with objects dedicated to a spiritual practice. Priceless works of art, both contemporary and from the 14th through 17th centuries, hung in condemnation of a corrupt Catholicism that supported itself through taxation of the poorer classes. The holy relics were bejeweled at the expense of the needs of the local population. Jan Farb captured this dichotomy with Sint-Jan, Holy Pill Peddler, in which a bronze scarab covered in gold leaf reminds of the disconnect between the riches of the scarab symbol in Egyptology and the drudgery of the beetle's earthly existence. Hoot placed Farb's piece at the altar in referencing John's gospel. He understood that the verse that Christ is like a scarab because both are, quote, only begotten, the creature is self-produced. And St. Augustine writes that the beetle was a symbol of Christ because he has rolled himself in our filth and chooses to be born from this filth ourself. Lastly, to return to the adoration of the mystic lamb, Chris Martin's gold bee was placed in the glass frame that protects the altarpiece. In ancient myths, bees connect the physical world with the afterlife. Bees also represent the sacrifice similar to the sacrificial lamb of the mystic lamb. Martin's bee is on its back in full surrender to the religious and art historical mystery of the altarpiece. 2020 was the year of Jan van Eyck. Ghent celebrated the artist as part of a year-long OMG. Van Eyck was here. The festival included exhibitions, events, activities across the city. It commemorated the return of the altarpiece to St. Bas after years of renovation. That renovation took place throughout Ghent, during which Gentenaars watched in real time across several venues. Celebratory slogans included Jan van Eyck, the genius behind the Ghent altarpiece, the great Jan van Eyck changed Western painting forever, who says Jan van Eyck says the Ghent altarpiece, and finally, Flanders is the ideal place to immerse yourself in Jan van Eyck's genius. In the same year, Chris Martin was given a retrospective of his work at SMAC, the museum that Hoot founded. The majority of the work subtly played with the adoration of the mystic lamb, including the little gold bee from Sint-Jan that I just showed you. SMAC described Martin's exhibition as making us look at representations of our ancestors, underscoring a link between contemporary Gentenaars to those who lived in medieval Ghent. In addition to the exhibit at SMAC, Altar, his replication of the frame of the altarpiece, was placed outside Sint-Bas. That's what you see here in the first slide. 2 additional artists were commissioned to exhibit their work in Sint-Bas. Both made direct references to the altarpiece and Jan van Eyck. Sophie Kuijken paints portraits using the same medieval technique invented and perfected by Jan. That's one of her pieces in the middle. And on the right, Lise Kouwaars recreates the natural sources of the pigments of the oil paint and blows them up into these large kind of almost abstract forms of the natural connection also in reference to all the details of the natural world that Jan incorporated into the Ghent altarpiece. In 2022, Flanders launched the Canon van Vlaanderen, the Canon of Flanders. The aim, according to Flemish education minister, was to highlight the people and events that, quote, have shaped the Flanders where we are now. It was sponsored by the unpleasantly right-wing Flemish National N-VA government. Hubert and Jan van Eyck made the list, but Jan Hoot did not. A very public outcry followed, but to be clear, people were also upset that beer and fries were also missing from the list. Thank you.